It was the 4th of October, Tuesday, and the sky that morning was the color of old tin, flat and low. The kind of sky that never quite decides to rain. I remember it exactly, because I had my checkbook in my coat pocket, and the checkbook was cold when I pulled it out. And I remember thinking that a thing you buy on a cold morning tends to stay cold in your mind a long while. 68 years old, standing on the courthouse steps in a county that had known my family for 4 generations, and the man beside me, Delbert Rourke, who farmed the good bottom land 2 roads over, looked at the parcel number on the sheet. Not a mean laugh. Delbert wasn't a mean man, but a laugh all the same. 70 acres of thorn and cedar and greenbrier, he said, and you're going to pay the back taxes on it. $1,140 for land nobody's walked in 30 years. What in the world do you want with a brush pile that big? I want to tell you the whole of it, because the whole of it took 2 years and it changed the way I think about difficult things. But before I get too far in, by the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The courthouse steps, and Delbert laughing, and $1,140 in back taxes for 70 acres nobody wanted. My grandmother used to say a thing, and I'll say it now because it belongs at the front of this. She'd say, "Land don't go bad, it just goes unread." Land don't go bad, it just goes unread. I heard her say it 100 times when I was small, and I never once understood it. I understood it well enough by the end of this, but I didn't yet, standing there with my cold checkbook, watching Delbert shake his head and walk off to his truck. The parcel was the old Halstead place, though nobody had been a Halstead on it since before the war. It had passed through a couple of hands, all of them absentee, all of them letting it go for the reason everybody let it go. It was steep on the north end and boggy in the middle, and the rest of it had been given over so completely to cedar and multiflora, rose and blackberry cane that you couldn't walk 10 feet into it without bleeding. When I was a girl, there'd been pasture up there. My father had run cattle across the top of that hill, and I had gone with him some mornings, and I remembered it open. But that memory was 60 years old, and everybody told me memory lies about land more than it lies about anything. The county had it listed as unimprovable. That was the word on the assessment sheet. Somebody in an office had decided that, typed it, and moved on. I paid the $1,140. The clerk, a young woman named Priya, who could not have been more than 25, printed my receipt and slid it under the glass and said, real gentle, like she was doing me a kindness, "You know that lot's mostly brush, right?" I said I knew. She said her uncle had looked at it years back for hunting and couldn't get his 4-wheeler past the fence line. I said I imagined not. I took my receipt, and I drove out there, and I stood at the gate, which was a bent gate, wired shut with baling wire gone to rust. And I looked at 70 acres of green wall, and I will be honest with you, my heart went down into my boots. It looked like a thing that would take a bulldozer a month and $40,000 I did not have. I stood at that bent gate a good long while. The wind came up and moved the top of the cedars, and that was the only thing moving in the whole of it. Now, I'd have to explain why I bought it at all, because I've told you, my heart sank, and a sensible person's heart sinking is usually the end of a story. My husband, Harlan, had passed 2 years before, and we'd never had children. And I'd sold off all but the home 40 when he got sick, because the medical bills were the medical bills. So I had a little money and a lot of quiet, and I'd gotten it into my head that I wanted ground again. Not for money, for something to be responsible to. When you've spent 40 years being responsible to a person, and then that person is gone, you find you don't know what to do with the responsibility. It sits in you like a tool you don't have a job for. So I bought the worst ground in the county because it was the cheapest ground in the county, and because some stubborn part of me remembered it open. I didn't do a thing with it for the rest of that autumn or the winter after. I'd drive out and stand at the gate. That was all. I'd stand there in the cold and look at the wall of it and drive home. My neighbor on my home place, an old friend named Ruth Ann, who taught school for 30 years and had opinions about everything, asked me one January afternoon what my plan was for the Halstead brush. She said, "Well, you can't cut 70 acres by hand and you can't afford to have it dozed, so unless you're planning to burn it and burn down half the county with it, I'd say you bought yourself a very expensive place to stand and look at trees." Ruth Ann was like that. She wasn't a doubter exactly. She just asked the practical question and left it hanging. What are you actually going to do? And I didn't have an answer. That February, going through the last of Harlan's things and my father's things, which had gotten mixed together in the shed over the years the way old people's things do, I found a wooden crate of my father's ledgers. He'd kept the farm books his whole life, and his father before him, and it was 3 generations of thin, cardboard-bound ledgers with the years written on the spines in pencil. I sat down on an overturned bucket in the cold shed instead and started reading them, because you don't throw out your father's handwriting the first time you sit down to it. And in the ledger marked 1951, in among the entries for seed, corn and a new team of mules and the price of hogs, I found a page my father had written that had nothing to do with money. He'd written it like a note to himself. It said, "The Halstead Hill has gone to cedar and thorn again. 3rd time in my life. Cattle won't touch it, and can't get through it. Old man Halstead cleared it with goats before the First War, ran 100 head of Spanish goats on it, and they ate it to the ground in 2 summers, and he had pasture. Everybody laughed at him for keeping goats when there was money in cattle. He didn't argue. He just had grass, and they had brush. Then he died, and the goats got sold, and the brush came back. And it has come back every generation since, because nobody wants to be the fool with the goats." I read that page and then I read it again. Everybody laughed at him for keeping goats. He didn't argue. He just had grass and they had brush. I sat in that cold shed a long time. My father had written that in 1951 and he'd never done it. He'd known the answer, and he'd run cattle anyway. Because cattle were what you did and goats were what people laughed at. And the hill had gone back to brush on his watch just like it had on his father's. 3 generations of men who knew the answer and were too proud to be the fool. Land don't go bad. It just goes unread, my grandmother had said. And here was the reading of it in pencil, in a crate I'd nearly thrown in the burn barrel. I took the ledger to Ruth Ann. I put it on her kitchen table open to the page, and I let her read it. She read it twice the way I had. Then she took off her glasses and she said, "Goats." And I said, "Goats." And she said, "How many?" I said the ledger said 100 head. She said, "And how much does a goat cost? And where do you keep 100 goats? And what do you do with them when the brush is gone?" Those were the right questions. Ruth Ann always asked the right questions. She wasn't telling me I was a fool. She was telling me the size of what I didn't know. That's a different thing. And I've come to be grateful for the people who do it. So I started to learn. I was 68, and I set out to learn goats, the way a person half my age might set out to learn a trade, which is to say, slowly and badly at first. I read what I could. I drove 3 counties over to a woman named Corinne, who ran meat goats, and asked her if I could just watch for a day. She let me. She was maybe 40, and she'd been doing it 15 years. And she told me the thing that turned it from a wild notion into a plan. She said, "Brush goats aren't about the goats. They're about the fence and the water, and the moving." She said a goat will eat anything green and woody, and it prefers the brush to grass, prefers the multiflora rose, and the cedar tips and the blackberry, which is exactly backwards from a cow. And that's the whole secret, that a goat considers your problem to be its supper. But she said if you just turn them loose on 70 acres, they'll eat the best of it and wander and get killed and do you no good. You have to fence them into a small piece, let them clean it hard and move them over and over. The eating is easy, she said. The moving is the work. That was the thing I needed to hear, because it told me this was a system and not a trick. It wasn't just get goats. It was fence a paddock, water the paddock, graze it down, move the fence, do it again 70 times more or less, across 2 years, following the goats around the hill in a slow spiral. The animals just showed up and ate. I could do the animals. The question was whether an old woman alone could do the fence and the water and the moving week after week in the heat and the cold. For 2 years I decided I could try. If it beat me, it beat me. But the ledger had beat 3 generations of my family by being too proud to try, and I didn't want to be the 4th name on that list. I bought portable electric netting. That was the modern part, and I'll own it, because I'm not against everything new, I'm just against paying for a bulldozer I can't afford. Electric netting comes in rolls. Mine were 164 feet each, and I bought 12 rolls, and a solar charger to run the fence, because there was no power within a mile of that hill. 12 rolls let me fence off about 1.5 acres at a time. The netting and the charger and the batteries and the fittings came to just under $2,000, which was more than I'd paid for the land, and Ruth Ann pointed that out, and I said the land was the down payment. I bought a 200-gallon water tank on a little trailer I could pull behind the old Ford, because there was no water up there either, or so I thought at the time. I want you to hold on to that. There was no water up there, or so I thought. I hauled every gallon that first spring. The goats I bought that April. Not 100. I couldn't manage 100 and couldn't afford 100. I bought 31 head of mixed Spanish and Kiko does, and 1 buck, at an average of $140 a head, from Corinne and from a sale barn 2 hours south. 31 goats and a buck. I built them a night pen down by the gate with cattle panels, and a shed made out of the salvaged tin off my old corn crib, because the coyotes on that hill were real, and Corinne had warned me the first thing you learn is what a dead goat looks like in the morning. I got a guardian dog, too, a big, shaggy Anatolian pup named Sunday, because I brought her home on a Sunday, and I'm not clever with names. She wasn't much use the first year. and then she was worth more than all the fence I owned. Ward got around the way it does. I don't know who saw the goats first, but by the middle of May, everybody knew that the widow woman who'd paid back taxes on the Halstead brush had gone and bought goats to clear it. He leaned on the bent gate and watched the goats, and he was kind about it, but he was clear. He said, "Myrna, I've cleared brush my whole life, and I'm telling you 30 goats on 70 acres is a teaspoon on a house fire. That hill will grow faster than they can eat. You'll be at this the rest of your life." And I didn't argue with him. I'd read my father's ledger, and I knew arguing with a man about goats was exactly the thing 3 generations of my family had lost to. So I just said, "Could be, Delbert, could well be." And I moved the fence. The county came out in June. I hadn't asked them to. A man from the extension office, young, maybe 30, name of Trevor, with a clipboard and a truck with the county seal on the door, came up the track and found me hauling water. He was polite. He said there'd been a note in the file that the Halstead parcel had changed hands, and he was doing a courtesy check on land use, and had I considered that 70 acres was awfully steep for grazing and prone to erosion. I said the cover was cedar and thorn, and it wasn't holding the soil any better than goats would, and if he had a soil survey, I'd love to see it because I'd been trying to read this ground for months. He softened a little at that. He said the survey listed most of the hill as marginal, and the bottom, in the middle, as hydric soils, wetland, basically, and I shouldn't disturb that. I said the goats weren't disturbing anything. They were eating brush and walking around, and he allowed that was probably true and wrote something on his clipboard and left. But he'd said a word. I filed away. Doubleland, in the middle of the hill, water. There was no water up there, or so I thought. The first summer nearly broke me, and I'll be honest about that because I don't want to make it sound like faith and goats, and it all came right. It didn't come right that year. The goats ate well. They ate the multiflora rows down to sticks and stripped the cedar, and cleaned about 11 acres in that first season, which was more than I'd hoped and nothing at all against 70. The hauling of water was the killing part. 200 gallons at a trip, 2 trips a day in July, up a track so rough it shook the fillings loose in your head. I lost 4 goats that first year. 2 to the coyotes before Sunday grew into herself, 1 to bloat, and 1 that just laid down and died the way a goat will sometimes for no reason. You can find every dead goat. Felt like Delbert leaning on the gate. Every dead goat felt like my father's pencil. There was a night in August, the worst heat of it, when I sat on my porch with the ledger and thought I'd made a fool's mistake with money I couldn't spare. I'd spent near $4,000 all told, and I had 11 cleared acres and 27 live goats, and a hill that grew back behind me. Faster than I liked, I read my father's page again by the porch light. Everybody laughed at him for keeping goats. He didn't argue. He just had grass and they had brush. And underneath it, my grandmother's voice. Land don't go bad, it just goes unread, and I thought, all right, I've been reading it a year. Maybe I haven't read enough of it yet. Maybe the difficulty isn't the answer being wrong. Maybe the difficulty is just the size of the reading. So, I decided to trust the slow of it. I decided 1 more year. That was the whole of the decision. 1 more year, and I'd move the fence in the morning like always. The second spring is when the hill started to answer me. Where the goats had cleaned that first 11 acres, grass came up. not brush. Grass, native grass, that must have had its seeds sleeping in that soil for 30 years under the cedar waiting. Corinne had told me it might, and I hadn't quite believed her. But there it was, green and fine, on ground the county had typed unimprovable. I stood in it, and I'll tell you, my eyes went grass. On the Halstead Hill, for the first time since my father ran cattle there when I was a girl. Land don't go bad, it just goes unread. The goats had kidded over the winter, too. 27 does, and my one buck had given me 38 kids. By that second summer I had better than 60 goats working the hill, and 60 goats is a different animal than 30. 60 goats moving through electric netting, an acre and a half at a time, cleared brush like a slow fire. I got faster at the moving. I'd have the fence down and up in a fresh spot in under 2 hours. Ruth Ann came out and helped some days, and mostly she just marveled at the grass. She stood in that first cleared field, and she didn't ask me any practical questions at all, which for Ruth Ann was a kind of surrender. And finally she said, "Well, I'll be." By late that second summer, the goats had worked their way up over the top of the hill and down into the boggy middle, the hydric soils, the place young Trevor had warned me off. I moved the fence careful in there, on the edges of it, because I didn't want to mire the goats or tear up wet ground. And the goats ate down a thicket of willow and cane, in the low center of that bog that had been there so long it was near a woodlot. And when they'd cleaned it, I walked in to move the netting, and my boot came down on stone. Not a rock. Cut stone, squared and set. I got down on my knees in the mud and cleared the cane roots and the muck away with my hands, and it was a ring of laid stone, dry-fitted. A circle maybe 4 feet across. Going down into the dark, an old hand-dug stone well capped over with a century of brush and silt sitting in the middle of a bog that the county had called wetland, except it wasn't wetland. The whole boggy middle of that hill was wet because the old well had been feeding a spring seep for 100 years unattended, choked, its water spreading out under the brush with nowhere to go. There was no water up there, I'd said, and I'd hauled every gallon for 2 years, and the whole time there'd been a well in the middle of it that my great-grandfather's neighbor, Old Man Halstead, had dug by hand, that the brush had swallowed so completely. I sat in the mud by that stone ring, and I laughed. I laughed the way you laugh when a thing is too much to take any other way. Land don't go bad, it just goes unread. And I had been reading it 2 years, and I had not read the one line that mattered most, till my goats turned the page for me. My father hadn't known about the well. It wasn't in the ledger. If he'd known, he'd have never hauled water, and maybe he'd have kept the goats, and the whole hill's history would have run different. The brush had hidden the well, and the hidden well had made the bog, and the bog had made the county call it unimprovable, and the unimprovable had made it cheap, and the cheap had let a widow with a checkbook buy it on a cold Tuesday in October, the whole chain of it. And every link in the chain was just brush that nobody had read. I had the well tested. I called Trevor at the extension office, and I told him what I'd found. And he came out with a different attitude than the first time. He brought a fellow from the state water office, a serious young hydrologist named Amara, with a case of instruments, meters and probes and a laptop, and she measured the flow and the depth, and she pulled a sample. The well was 31 feet deep, dry-fit stone the whole way, standing plumb after 100 and more years, and it was recharging at 3.2 gallons a minute off a live spring. Clean water, testing clean on every panel she ran. She stood there, looking at the numbers on her laptop, and then at the old stone, and then at me. And she said she couldn't quite account for it. She said a hand dug well that old had no business standing true, and no business testing that clean, and that the reason the middle of the hill had come up as hydric on the survey was almost certainly this, the well and its spring, and that the survey had never known why, because nobody had ever cleared the brush to look. She said, "Honestly, ma'am, machines never would have found this. You'd have graded this whole middle for drainage and buried it. Whatever cleared it was gentle enough to leave it standing." And I said, "Goats." She put the well in the state's record. That's the part I'm proudest of. And I'll say it plain because my grandmother would want it said plain. There is now a line in a state water office file that reads, "Halstead, hand-dug, stone. Well circa 1910, spring-fed, recharge 3.2 gallons per minute, inute, rediscovered and documented." Old man Halstead dug it with a shovel before the First War, and everybody's forgotten his first name. But the state knows about his well now, and it'll stand in the record longer than it stood in the brush. Delbert came back that fall, the second fall, 2 years almost to the day. From the courthouse steps, he walked the hill with me. He saw the 50-some acres cleared and grassed, the grass fine and native on ground he'd told me would grow faster than my goats could eat. And he saw the goats, near 90 head by then, fat and working, and he saw the old well ringed round now with cleared ground and a good clean lid I'd built for it. He didn't say much. Delbert wasn't a man for much. He stood a while and looked at the grass, and then he said, "Well, you had grass and they had brush." And I knew he'd heard the story of my father's ledger from Ruth Ann, because those were near the exact words off the page, and I understood that Delbert was telling me in the only way a man like him could. I didn't answer him. Some concessions you let sit. I just nodded, and we walked back down. I want to give you the honest numbers because I don't like a story that only tells the good side. Over 2 years, I spent right around $5,200 all told. Land and fence and goats and dog and tank and fuel. And I lost 9 goats along the way to coyotes and bloat and the mysteries of goats. I cleared 54 acres of the 70, and the steep north 16 I've left in cedar on purpose, because it's too steep to graze safe, and it holds the soil and the goats can browse its edges. I have grass where there was thorn, and water where I thought there was none, and a herd worth more than I paid for the land. I don't call that a triumph. I call it an answer to a question my family asked for 3 generations, and was too proud to hear the answer to. The hill didn't get conquered. It got read. I'm 70 years old now, standing most mornings at a gate that isn't wired shut with rusted baling wire anymore, because I hung a good new gate, and I look up a hill that's green where it was a green wall, and it's a different green, and I think about how the difference between a problem and a resource is only whether you've learned to read the ground. That bog wasn't a wetland to drain, it was a well to uncover. That brush wasn't a curse. It was 2 years of supper for animals that consider your worst trouble their favorite meal. The county typed unimprovable, and they were reading it fast. The way machines read, and my grandmother read it slow. The way patient people read, and she was right and the county was wrong. and it only took 100 years and a hand-dug well and 31 goats to prove it. Land don't go bad, it just goes unread. She said it 100 times, and I understand it now. So I'll leave you with the thing I've been turning over. Every one of you has got a piece of ground somewhere, and I don't just mean dirt. You've got some inherited trouble that everybody's told you is unimprovable. Some brush pile too big to cut and too poor to bother. Some difficulty your own family gave up on because being the fool who tries is harder than being the wise one who lets it grow over. And I'd bet money there's an old well in the middle of it that nobody's read down to yet, because the brush is in the way, and reading is slow work. I'd love to hear about yours. Tell me in the comments what your Halstead Hill is. The thing everybody laughed at you for taking on, and whether your goats have gotten down to the stone yet. I'll read every one slow, the way my grandmother taught me, because land don't go bad. It just goes unread, and somebody has to be patient enough and unproud enough to turn the page.